Good evening, folks. Welcome to almost the last class on the Book of Acts. This is the 80th session that we have had in Acts. We've got two more to go before we are done. And then Andrew Knapp will be taking over and teaching a new series on 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. But that starts on Monday, the 31st. I'd like to start this evening with a reading of Psalm 29. Psalm 29, which reads, Ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders, the Lord over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is majestic. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. The Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon to skip like a calf, and Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. The voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth and strips the forest bare, and all in his temple cry, Glory. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace. I love that psalm. One of my very favorites. The seven thunders of God, or the seven voices of God. We're going to be in Acts chapter 27. I'm going to read for you in just a minute, starting in Acts 27, verse 1, and we're going to continue down through Acts chapter 28, verse 10, because this covers. I planned to go all the way to Rome this evening, but that I thought we'd at least get Paul safely to uh, one of the stops along the way. Paul is going to set sail along with some other prisoners, some Roman soldiers who are led by a centurion, um, a sailing crew, obviously, on the vessel that they are on, and numerous other individuals. More than 200 people are going to be on the final boat that Paul is taking. Well, not the final boat, the boat that then ends up getting destroyed at the end of our reading this evening when they crash land on at the island of Malta. And Luke writes, this is probably one of the most vivid um, sections of scripture that you're going to find in the New Testament. It reads like an adventure movie script. The breathtaking, death-defying flight through danger, narrowly escaping death, and somehow arriving safely and intact, and Luke just writes it vividly, and it's a wonderful piece of writing as Paul is going. And after I read this, I'm going to share a screen that has a map on it, and I'll walk you through the steps of what I just read before we go back and make a few comments along the way. But I want to read this section for you because uh, number one, I'm going to read you the entire book of Acts. If you have been in all of the classes, you'll have heard it read out loud. And number two, to get you in the frame of mind, put yourself on the boat as I'm reading, because it's a scary trip that these guys are going to take. It starts out like most roller coasters do, slow and gentle and easy, and you're saying to yourself, this isn't so bad. And then the bottom drops out. And if you're like me, you have your hands up in the air and you're screaming like a madman uh, as the ride rockets you through the curves and the over the hip bumps and loops and whatever. I don't know if Paul's ship ever did a loop, but it certainly did a lot of different things. So, Acts chapter 27, beginning in verse 1. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners over to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out from sea to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salome. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. Running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on some island. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms, and fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and soldiers, Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then, hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable. And then the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their mind and said that he was a god. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put us on board. They put on board whatever we needed. So, like I said, this reads like an adventure story. And hopefully, in the account that Luke writes here, you can see the hand of God at work as Paul and his companions are delivered safely from this storm. So I want to share my screen, if I can find the sharing thing. There's the sharing thing. And share that. Hopefully, you can see the map on my screen. I know some of you, sorry, Gail, you're going to have difficulty. I made my mouse cursor big and red. Hopefully, it's visible to those of you who are on smaller devices. Luke's account, Paul is in Caesarea, down here in Palestine, just above Jerusalem, where he had been held in the court of Felix and left there for 2 years until Festus succeeded Felix. Festus has meets with the Jews. They want to kill Paul. Paul appeals to Caesar. Here begins Paul's journey to go to Caesar. Luke tells us that they set sail on a ship from Adramyttium, which is up here in Asia, northern Asia, on the Aegean Sea, not the Adriatic. The Adriatic is over here. This is the Aegean Sea. So this is their home port up here. They're down here in Caesarea. They sail first up to Sidon, where we're told in verse 3 that they put in Sidon. The centurion treats Paul kindly, lets him meet with his friends in town. They can take care of him. He trusts Paul because Paul is, while he may be in chains on the boat, he is a Roman citizen. He's uncondemned. And so he's going to be treated with greater honor. We're told then in verse 4, that they sail around the lee of Cyprus. Here's Cyprus here. They go north of Cyprus, out of the winds, and come eventually over to Myra in the province of Lycia. Here's where they get on the big boat. They get on a freighter from Alexandria down here in Egypt, off the northern African coast. The ship here in Myra is headed to Italy. It's a grain ship. It is carrying grain that is eventually going to end up here in Rome. The Roman emperor Claudius. Claudius, during his reign, paid a bounty, a premium, to captains of grain boats who were willing to sail off season when the seas were dangerous, up to the point of compensating for loss, even loss of the cargo, loss of they need to be able to prove that, hey, we were bringing this grain, we lost it in the storm. So these guys are willing to take a chance. And we read that Paul says, hey, we really shouldn't be sailing down here when they're in Crete. But they leave Myra. They get as far as Cnidus here. I think the sea is silent. I'm pronouncing it as though it's silent. If it's silent, am I really pronouncing it? Hmm. It's silent. Cnidus. They go past Cnidus and they encounter the wind. The wind is blowing to the south. They can't go into the wind. They want to go across the Adriatic over to Achaia and then into the Adriatic where they'll have safer sailing. But they get caught in the wind, and so they have to come down around the bottom of Crete, where they put in at a place called Fair Havens, near the city of Lycia, where they stay for a period of time. And I'll go through the chronology of this in just a few minutes. But the harbor here in Fair Havens is not one that they can winter over in. So they want to go over here to Phoenix. This is a journey of somewhere between 25 and 50 miles. And they take off on a day when there's a gentle wind, thinking our ship has come in or our wind has come in. As they leave, the wind turns sour, and again, this wind blowing from the northeast, comes down and catches them so that they have to go past this little island here called Cauda. And then 14 days they spend. And this wavy line here probably is not representative of how wobbly they were in their journey and how bucking and thrashing on the waves they were. One of the maps I have in another atlas has spirals here as they were sailing in circles and whatnot. But 14 days they are driven by a storm until they land here on this little island called Malta, which is where I ended our reading. They spend the winter here on Malta, and eventually next week we'll see that oops, don't need that. They sail north to Syracuse, off the island of Sicily, then to Rhegium, and eventually put in up here at Puteoli, where they pick up the Appian Way and head on into Rome, which is where we will end next week with Paul in Rome, uh, carrying out a ministry there. But this is a really, really long journey. If you look at the scale up here, this is several bits of 300 miles. So 1,000-ish miles that they sail, much of it, more than half of it, let's say, off course, being driven by this fierce wind. I'm going to stop the share so that I can get you all back here in front of me so that we can go back and make a few comments here on this text. As I said, Luke writes this vividly. And there's a lot of questions. Some people wonder, people who studied Acts wonder, why does Luke devote 60 verses to Paul's trip from Caesarea to Malta and then eventually on to Rome? Where are the tales of what happened to Peter? Why don't we read more about Peter or any of the other apostles? Where's John? Wasn't John the disciple that Jesus loved? How come we don't know anything about John in the book of Acts? I think there are a couple of reasons for this. Primarily, Luke is present for this journey. He says in chapter 27 and verse 1, and when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, when you read we in Acts, Luke is included in that we. Luke is the author of Acts, and so he's giving us a first person account of what's going on. And this is an event that would be vivid in his memory because these people are frightened for their lives in the middle of this storm, and Luke gets to experience firsthand the miraculous deliverance that God gives them, that not a soul was lost in this tremendous storm. And secondly, Paul is finally, after languishing for 2 years in where he was kept under house arrest in Caesarea, Paul is finally on his way to Rome, where he is going to stand before Caesar. And so Luke is showing us God is fulfilling this promise. Paul is going to go and stand before Caesar in Rome. But I think the big thing here is this underscores for us the fact that there is no way Paul can get to Rome unless it's by divine providence. It's only God who is going to bring Paul into Rome because Paul is going there at God's command and to carry out God's purpose. And so God is going to see his purpose completed in Paul. It's not going to be by any human effort. And we'll see that as we uh, pick out a few verses here and there as we go through the text, looking at the shipwreck. So this is an important thing for Luke. Obviously, Paul is Luke's hero. I put that in quotation marks because Luke stays with Paul right up to the end. He's there with Paul in Rome, and we'll look at that a little bit later here as we go down through the text. So Luke has this um, special relationship with Paul. And so he's going to recount for us the journey that Paul takes. It begins well enough in the first 8 verses. The voyage begins. Uh, there are no such things as passenger ships in the ancient world. All ships are cargo ships, essentially. There may be some troop ships that Rome would have, but the reason for ships is to earn a living. There are fishing vessels and there are cargo vessels. Uh, Peter, James, John, Andrew, they were fishermen. They had fishing vessels. Cargo vessels are larger boats, and so if you want to take passage on a ship, I'm sure there's a fee involved. You have to pay your way. Paul has been taken care of by his friends here in Caesarea for some time, and we're told the reason Felix kept Paul in prison there for 2 years was he was hoping to get a bribe. He was hoping for Paul to pay him something so that Felix would release him. Paul never did. Obviously, Felix knew that Paul had money, and so Paul is able to pay. He would probably have to pay his own way. The prisoners, the ones who are under sentence of condemnation, probably they don't have to pay. They're being brought to Rome to face the penalty of their crimes. This centurion that they are with, a man named Julius in verse 1, Julius is a name for a Roman citizen, so he's probably favorably disposed to Paul because Paul is also a Roman citizen. Paul is not a man under condemnation. He's simply being transported from point A to point B by way of point X as they make this journey. We're told that Aristarchus in verse 2 is with Paul. We met Aristarchus back in Acts chapter 19 and verse 29. Let's see. This is in Ephesus during the riot in verse 28. They heard this, they were enraged, crying out, "Great is Artemis to the Ephesians." The city was filled with confusion, and they rushed together into the theater, dragging with them Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians who were Paul's companions in travel. And we're told in chapter 27, verse 2, that Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, accompanies Paul on the ship. We read about him in the book of Philemon in verse 24. Philemon having only one chapter. Verse 23, Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends greetings to you. So do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. And again in Colossians chapter 4, in verse 10, let's see, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. So it's unclear if Aristarchus here in Acts 27 is a prisoner or if he is accompanying Paul uh, just as one of Paul's companions and later becomes a prisoner, or if he is participating in Paul's house arrest by remaining there with Paul and is thus making himself a prisoner. It's not clear, but we read of him there in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 10, and in Colossians 4 verse 14, Luke is also there. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. So Luke and Aristarchus stay with Paul through this journey and into his house arrest in Rome, where Paul is going to minister there for quite some time, as we'll see next week. So they sail off the first bit of the journey up to Sidon. Julius lets Paul um, gives leave Paul leave to go and visit his friends in Sidon. There's a Christian community in Sidon. We don't read of any church being planted there, but there's obviously Christians there, and Paul knows of them. So he goes and he visits with them. The next day, they set sail and they eventually arrive at Myra. So everything seems to be going according to plan. There they find a ship. From Alexandria that is heading for Italy in verse 6. And Paul goes aboard, the prisoners go aboard, Paul's companions go aboard. There's a lot of people on this ship. Luke tells us in verse 37 there are 276 persons on this ship. This is an Alexandrian cargo ship, a grain hauler. These are big boats. Uh, they can range the amount of cargo that they can carry ranges somewhere between 250 tons and 340 tons. So let's say, for sake of argument, that's 300 tons. That's 600,000 pounds of cargo on this ship. It's a big boat. Think barge. This is a large sailing vessel that is carrying a large amount of grain en route to Rome because they will make good money. It is starting to get late in the sailing season. As we find out when the ship leaves and they encounter a wind that forces them to go down to Crete rather than sailing due west like they hoped to sail through the islands of the Aegean Sea, eventually into Achaia. And they're driven down to this fair havens of the southern coast of Crete in verse 8 of chapter 27. And we're told in verse 9 that since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was already over, and a lot of people have tried to work out the chronology. And there are several possible chronologies that are given there. And Luke is explaining that the danger of this journey here, because between roughly November 11th and March 10th, sailing was perilous. And he's referring to the fast, that would be the Day of Atonement, had already passed. And so I looked through the chronologies. I wrote one down here that may be correct, it may fit, but it gives you an idea of the time frame that is taking place here. If it was the year AD 59, so if this is 59 AD. The Day of Atonement was October 5th. That's already passed, Luke tells us. So if we guesstimate that they departed from Fair Havens on October 15th, and they have this 3-day period where they are fighting from fighting the winds. They're trying to get to the safe harbor of Phoenix, but they can't. 3 days in chapter 27, verses 14 to 19, they are uh, struggling against the wind. They pass by that small island called Cauda, and then November 1st would be the end of 14 days. And Luke, I keep calling Acts Luke. I've done it all through this Bible study series. Acts 27, verse 27 and 33. They spend 14 days bouncing along westward in the Mediterranean Sea, fearing for their lives. Eventually, November 2nd, they end up ashore in Malta, uh, where they spend 3 days in Publius's home, which would be November 5th. They then spend 3 months there, so that would put you at February 5th before they begin making preparations to sail north. So they're still going to sail through some very rough seas, but the ship's captain wants to get, or at least the centurion wants to get his charges delivered into Rome. But I like how Luke gives us this much detail. It lends credibility to his text that Paul did not end up on the island of Malta without there being some price to pay, the price being the cargo and eventually the ship itself, but no human lives, which is an unusual detail. Uh, Shipwrecks were very common things in ancient times, and people knew that when they took ship, they were risking their lives. Josephus writes of a shipwreck in which he was involved, that he was on a ship with 600 people. Not all of those survived the shipwreck. Josephus obviously did because he lived to write and tell about it. But it gets interesting in Acts. This is still the book of Acts. Acts chapter 27. In verse 14, they had set sail when the south wind blew gently, because that's blowing them up to the coast of Crete, and they're going to be able to reach this harbor in Phoenix, and everything is going to go according to the plan of the ship's owner. Paul has already warned them. Paul has already warned them in verse 9, 10, saying, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury and much loss. He says to the cargo, the ship, and of our lives. Nobody's lives were lost. Paul's making a false prophecy here. The Bible is erroneous, and we should all just disconnect from this class and go live our lives the way we want to live our lives. No, where we can't understand or we can't make it mesh together, the problem lies with our understanding. He talks about injury and loss. The ship is lost, the cargo is lost. Injury is something that happens to people. Obviously, injury can happen to a ship too, but injury can happen to the people. It may be that people were injured in this shipwreck. They hit that reef and the ship is beginning to break apart and people are jumping overboard and swimming ashore. They're clinging to bits of drift and whatnot, but they're getting battered about. And so Paul's not prophesying falsely here. Don't presume too much on the text. The centurion listens rather not to Paul, but to the pilot, the guy who's the professional sailor, and to the owner of the ship who wants to get it moving because he's expecting a fat paycheck once they make delivery in Rome. He pays attention to the experts. What does this Jewish prophet from a landlocked city know of sailing? Paul is not an expert sailor. He is a preacher. He's an evangelist. So let's listen to the experts. They set sail, and then verse 14 says, but soon. Luke likes the word but, and he uses it very strategically in his text. But soon, a tempestuous wind. The Greek word there is typhonikos, from which we get the English word typhoon. Hurricane force wind against the ship, driving southwestward, forcing them towards the African coast. They don't want to go to Africa. They want to go north. They want to go more northwest because that's where Rome is. They're being driven southwest. And we're told that for a long time, they spend caught in the middle of this storm. They raise the ship's boat. That's the lifeboat, the dinghy that would be trailed along behind the ship. They raise it with great difficulty. Luke includes himself here in this uh, pulling up of the ship's boat in verse uh, 16. We managed with great difficulty to secure the ship's boat. So they either brought it up on deck or they tied it fast to the side of the ship. And then they girded the ship. It sounds like they passed ropes underneath the keel and secured them above deck, essentially tying the ship together, using the ropes to strengthen the hull of the ship because it's going to take a pounding as they're smashing through these waves for 14. They don't know they're going to be smashing through waves for 14 days, but they're going to be smashing through the waves for 14 days. And in verse 18, it says, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. Now, I've always pictured this in my mind that they threw a couple of boxes overboard, maybe a few barrels, and a little bit of, a little bit of other stuff to lighten up the ship. Remember what I said earlier, Alexandrian grain freight ship, 600,000 pounds of grain. Some of these ships carried it loose, down in the hold, not in bags. And during a violent storm, the grain would flow and could form waves of its own and threaten to capsize a ship. Some of it other ships carried it in bags. We're not told. Luke doesn't give us that detail. Uh, he doesn't tell us how much or how it was stored. So let's say, for sake of argument, that it's in bags. You've got 276 people on board this ship. Let's say 76 of them are needed to sail the boat. Okay, you got the sailors, and then you've got 200 other individuals. You can't use the prisoners. The prisoners are normally tied to one of the masts so that they can't escape. But still, 200 people unloading 300 tons of grain. They don't do that in a couple hours. A ship in port, uh, unloading at dockside with winch equipment would take 12 days on average to unload the ship. They're unloading it by hand. Granted, they're not, stacking it neatly. They're heaving it over the side of the boat. So they gain a little speed that way, but still, even with people forming a bucket line, this is a task of weeks. This is a task of many days, to the point that in verse 38, there's still grain on board because they're eating it. And after they eat it, they threw the wheat out into the sea. So they're busy. They are trying desperately to make this ship lighter so that it won't sink during the force of the storm. We're told in verse 19, the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. This is probably the long spar the very long spar on the ship that they would have to lower down to the deck with great difficulty, and then it would take a lot of people to throw that overboard to help the ship not be quite so top heavy. One thing you don't want when your ship is rolling this way and that is for your center of gravity to be way up in the air. You want your center of gravity down low where hopefully you stay, but you don't want to be so heavy that you swamp. So they're in a bit of a dilemma. They're trying to lighten the ship any way they can. And it gets to the point in verse 20 when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest lay on us. We're still in the heart of this storm. Luke writes this poignant phrase: all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. They gave up hope. All human efforts to get this ship under control have been for naught. They are still being driven along. And it's at that point when Paul, ever the tactful apostle, stands up and said, "You should have listened to me. I told you so." Hopefully, he said it a little more tactfully than that. And how these people can hear him in the middle of a storm, I don't know. Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. But then in verse 22, he says, yet now, I urge you to take heart. There will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And again, he gives the prophecy. An angel from the God I serve stood before me this very night and said, Paul, you have to stand before Caesar. You're going to stand before Caesar, and God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, he says in verse 25, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told, but we must run aground on some island. This is an important little speech that Paul gives because shortly after this, the 14th night had come. As they're being driven across the sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected they were nearing land. They took a sounding and found that it was 20 fathoms deep, which I'm told is about 120 feet. Uh, and then they take a second sounding a little bit later, around 15 fathoms, so the 90 feet. The land is coming up. They're nearing shore. And they are fearing that they're going to run aground, so they drop four anchors from the back of the boat and pray for day to come. And it's at this point when the sailors decide we need to get up, we need to abandon ship, we need to get off this boat. So they begin to let down the ship's lifeboat under the pretense that they're going to go to the front of the ship and they're going to let down anchors at the bow of the ship. Their real plan is to row it away as fast as they can toward land and see you guys later. Good luck. You're about to crash. Hope you don't all die. When Paul says to the centurion in verse 31 and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Now, this is the same centurion who didn't listen to Paul earlier. Now he's listening to Paul. Something has shifted here. Paul has risen in this guy's estimation. And so he orders the sailors, and they cut the rowboat loose. So now we need the professional sailors on this vessel if we are going to safely make it to land. Without the professional sailors on the boat, the centurion doesn't know how to steer the boat. None of the prisoners know how to steer the boat. Nobody else knows how to sail this thing except the sailors. We need the sailors on the boat. Don't let them escape in the rowboat. Makes sense to the centurion. Everybody stay on the boat. Dawn is approaching in verse 33. Paul says, you need to eat something. You've been 14 days without eating. That shows you how desperate the situation is. These guys are so busy with the unloading of the boat and frantically trying to get it under control and do whatever they can to keep it all together in one piece that nobody has stopped to eat. And Paul takes bread, he breaks it, he gives thanks in their sight, and he begins to eat. They're all encouraged. And so they take food too. And then they throw the rest of it overboard because they're getting closer and closer to land as this boat is being driven in. Day comes, they see land. They see a sandy beach, and they decide, let's aim the boat at that sandy beach and run it aground there. What they don't see is the reef between them and the shore that the boat runs into, and it sticks fast. In verse 41, the bow strikes the reef and it remains immobile. The stern begins breaking up because the sea is pounding it. The soldiers decide to kill the prisoners because if the prisoners jump overboard and swim away and escape, then eventually those soldiers are going to be held accountable and they will have to pay the penalty of the crime that the man that escaped was charged with. So the simple expedient way to avoid that is to kill the prisoners. The prisoners, they're under sentence anyway. Let's just execute them here and be done with. The centurion, though, verse 43, wants to save Paul because so far what Paul has been saying has come about. Maybe this man really is something special. He orders them instead, if you can swim, jump and make for land. The rest of you go on planks and look at the last phrase of chapter 27. So it was that all were brought safely to land. You remember what I emphasized earlier in verse 20? All our hope of being saved had been abandoned. They'd given up. Now every one of them safely makes it to shore. Not by human effort, but because of the providence of God, because of the deliverance of God. God divinely delivers these people. But it's not over for Paul. After they land, they learn that they're on the island of Malta. Malta is, I need to get to the last pages of my notes. Very small island. It's about 18 miles long and 8 miles wide. It is about 60 miles south of Sicily and 180 miles north of the coast, the northern coast of Africa. A long, long way off course from where they wanted to be. There is minimal Roman presence on this island. Publius, that we read about in chapter 28, could be a Roman official. He might just be the head honcho of the people who live on this island. Luke uses an interesting word, the native people. He calls them barbaroi, from which you get the word barbarian, which in that culture simply means they didn't speak Greek. People who did not speak Greek were classified as barbarians because Greek was the civilized tongue of the civilized world. That also probably means that they didn't have Greek culture. So they weren't familiar with the Greek way of life. But they show unusual kindness, Luke says. Not everybody who was shipwrecked and made it to shore was greeted kindly by people who found them. One ancient writer compares refugees from war to those rescued from a shipwreck, naked and destitute. And there are other ancient accounts of people who came out of shipwrecks who were not received hospitably by the people that they who found them, because when you are jumping off a ship to swim ashore, you do not first grab your chest of gold coins and hug it close to your chest. You're fleeing for your life. You're running. You're jumping. And if your clothes begin weighing you down while you're swimming, you're taking them off. whatever it takes to get to shore alive. You don't bring your worldly goods with you. So you arrive maybe with the clothes on your back, maybe not. But they welcome these people with unusual kindness. They kindle a fire. Paul gets a bundle of sticks to put on the fire. He puts it on the fire, and out comes the snake, grabs onto his hand. The natives see this and say, aha, he's a bad guy. He escaped the sea, but justice caught up with him. They personify justice as a god, that the god justice has, tried to kill this Paul person by drowning him in the ocean. He made it out of the ocean alive, but justice caught up with him in the end. Amos writes about this in Amos chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. Those who flee from the day of the Lord, who are looking forward rather to the day of the Lord. God says, why are you doing that? The day of the Lord is going to be like a man who runs away from a bear only to meet a lion, or a man who gets home and escapes the danger, and he puts his hand up on the wall and breathes a sigh of relief only to have a scorpion sting him. Uh, Fate is going to catch you up, in other words. And people believe this. Paul shakes the snake off, and they're all watching him, wide-eyed. He's going to swell up. He's going to fall over dead. And it doesn't happen. And it says they watched for a long time. Uh, in verse 6, they waited a long time, but saw no misfortune overtake him. So they changed their opinion. No, he's not a murderer. Now he's a god. The pendulum goes from one extreme all the way over to the other extreme. Paul doesn't rebuke them for this supposition because they don't fall down in worship of him. They simply mistake him as being some sort of deity, which is when we run into Publius. And I know we're just about out of time, but so I'm just about out of my notes. They run into Publius, the chief man. The Greek text says he's the first man of the island. Uh, he's the chief citizen, possibly the local governor. And his father is ill with a fever and dysentery, um, high fever, diarrhea, could be any number of possible diseases, often fatal. And Paul prays, lays his hands on him, and heals him. The result being, remember I said this is a small island, 18 miles by 8 miles. Every single sick person on that island comes to Paul, and he heals them all. The result of that is that the people embrace Paul and his companions for the time that they spend. And it's going to be 3 months, verse 11. They spend 3 months on that island, hosted by these natives, because God has worked miracles through Paul in their presence. Paul has ministered to them. Paul, the prisoner, has become the rescuer of the people here who were sick. Obviously, it's God who did the rescuing. He worked through his servant, Paul. So I asked earlier, after I read it, I'll ask again, do you see the hand of God in these events? I hope you do. Peter wrote, I see it. Well, yeah, it's fairly obvious. You see the hand of God. Of course, Peter may have been referring to my cursor on the screen or the screen that I was sharing. But still, it's easy to see the hand of God at work here in bringing Paul this far in his journey safely. Yes, they lost the boat. Yes, they lost the grain. They didn't lose their lives. Paul said, not a hair of your head. They didn't even lose any of their hair swimming ashore. That's how thorough God's deliverance has been. Next week, we will pick up the story in verse 11 and we'll finish out the book of Acts with Paul's ministry in Rome under house arrest there, his encounter with the Jews, his encounter with the brethren in Rome, and finish out the book of Acts. The week after that, we'll have a recap class. I don't know if we'll recap the entire book of Acts, but we might recap at least this last portion that Paul, from his arrest in Jerusalem to his travels to Rome. We'll probably back up further than that because there's some other things I want to touch on. But I find it interesting here. We go from all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned to, and so it was that all were brought safely to land. That's a miracle. God performed a miracle in rescuing his servant and everybody who was with Paul on that ship. So I'm going to stop the recording